This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In 18th century Bavaria, a prosperous apothecary, Johann Wilhelm Weinmann, began an extraordinary project, the compilation of an A to Z of plants, meticulously documented and lavishly illustrated by botanical artists using the latest colour printing methods of the time. He aimed to include thousands of plants from all over the world, describing their individual characteristics and commissioning magnificent colour illustrations of each specimen. The first complete volume of the Phytanthoza Iconographia, as he called it, was published in 1737, and the work grew to 4 immense tomes. The Iconographia gives an unparalleled view of the ornamental and useful plants that were known to botanists and gardeners in the early 18th century. Caroline has written 2 books, a Splendour of Succulents and Cacti, and a Cornucopia of fruit and vegetables, which document how this piece of work came to be collated, and which reproduce many of the amazing images featured within. First off, I loved the books. I thought they were so interesting and just fascinating to think what was being grown in a time that we think is very much the distant past. And so I wondered really if we could start by talking about what was the idea behind the books.
Well, they all stem from a treasure stashed in a library. Anyone who's ever watched the many episodes of Morse, that detective series with John Thaw, will think of the Bodleian Library in Oxford as a good place to hide a dead body. But of course, it's actually full of old books, many of them very rare. And one of the aims of the Bodleian is to introduce some of their hidden treasures to a wider world without endangering them. And one of these treasures is the little-known 18th century work of a gentleman called Johann Wilhelm Weinmann. He made the mistake, to our modern ears at least, of giving his book a mouthful of a name, Phytanthoza, if I get this right, Phytanthoza Iconographia, which really just means pictorial representation of plants and flowers. And the volumes are full of beautiful and often unusual plant images printed in full colour. So what I hope is that my little books will bring the Iconographia out into the 21st century world. And I've delved into it by theme, starting with a cornucopia of fruit and vegetables. And now the next one has just come out, which is a Splendour of succulents and cacti.
Lovely. So does that mean that there are potentially more in the series?
We'll see how things go. I would love to do bulbs. There are some beautiful tulips and lilies and things, and a lot to say about them. But yeah, we'll see how things go.
Lovely. So the Iconographia, what was his motivation behind putting it together at the time?
Well, he was an apothecary. And he made his name because in his late 20s, he moved south to Bavaria, to a historic old town called Regensburg on the banks of the Danube. And he bought up an old pharmacy that had fallen on hard times, made a great success of it. And so that gave him the money to do what he wanted, really. And so he turned his mind to different projects. He created a botanical garden in the town, and then he set his mind to an altogether more ambitious project. Pharmacists and medical people of all sorts acquired much of their information on medicinal plants from illustrated herbals. And so his plan was to compile and publish one that was bigger and more comprehensive than anything else available. And in particular, he wanted the illustrations to be modern, which is to say, instead of using old woodcuts or black and white etchings, his would be beautifully coloured. In fact, the Iconographia was one of the very earliest books to use colour printing.
So did he just concentrate on plants with medicinal uses?
Yes, but almost, no, he said all, in the front of the book, he says all the plants in the world that are known. But in the text descriptions that accompany them, his emphasis is on how they might be used, not just medicinally, because there were obviously things like dye plants for colouring and edible ones. But yes, his emphasis was definitely on the medicinal and more plants, of course, because they didn't have all the drugs that we've got now. An awful lot of plants were used medicinally.
I mean, that is such an undertaking, for want of a better word, the ego of him to think that he could catalogue all the plants. I mean, it seems spectacular now, but at the time, was he concentrating on plants that were found in cultivation and in particular areas?
No, worldwide, wild or cultivated, everything.
Incredible, isn't it? Have you any idea how much of it he did manage to catalogue as a kind of percentage? Do we know that?
No, we don't. I mean, even something you brought out today wouldn't categorize everything in the world. When you think of there are plants still being found in the Brazilian rainforests and things dying out, of course, at the other end of the line. So I don't think it would be possible really even to begin to calculate what percentage of the known plants he actually covered. But they certainly included a much wider range than he would ever have set eyes on, a lot of tropical plants and some plants that people weren't really sure what they looked like.
I think actually you've hit the nail on the head there, and that's, I suppose, my arrogance to assume that what we know today is actually the sum of the plants in the world. And of course it's not, it's a snapshot, which is exactly what his book also gives us, is a snapshot of what could be named and identified at that time. But it's interesting what you say then about, you know, he would have included plants he never set eyes on. So where did he source the plants that were included? I'm guessing he commissioned people to document these plants. Did he do any kind of fact-checking to make sure that they were correct representations?
Fact-checking, I have no idea, to be honest. And certainly some were more accurately depicted than others. I mean, it's very plain to see, for instance, when you look at the cabbages and the other brassicas, of which there are quite a few, they're shown in great and painstaking detail, and almost certainly they were painted from life. And it's probably safe to assume that many of the other common vegetables and familiar wildflowers, the same would have applied. And also, perhaps more surprisingly, in the book, there's a large collection of aloes and cacti, and they were probably portraits of actual specimens because so many of them are shown not in isolation or in the land in which they might grow, but presented in really fancy pots, just as they would have been displayed by proud owners as part of a collection. We might talk about the pots and the things later on, but I was just going to say is there were plenty that neither he nor his artists would have had access to, and so they would either have had to have relied on dried specimens or the art of previous artists who themselves may not have had direct access to certain plants. And Weinmann does sometimes acknowledge a source. There's a Dutch botanist called Abraham Munting. He uses some of his drawings as a basis. But sometimes you do wonder, I don't know whether you've had a chance to look at the bananas, for instance. They do look like the result of a sort of illustrator's Chinese whispers. And the papaya as well. The tree is fairly realistic, but the papaya itself looks a bit more like a walnut, to be honest.
Yes, in fact, funny you should say that. I was just flicking through the book before I started speaking to you, and I think that it was papaya that I looked at and was thinking, wow, that looks quite alien. So yeah, and actually, yes, you're quite right. As an aside, I was going to mention the pots because apart from the plants, you've got these magnificent pots depicted. And I did wonder if during the course of your research, did you find out anything about those pots?
I didn't do any specific research, but they are wonderful, aren't they?
Beautiful.
And the aloes, which are mostly the ones shown in pots, were a particular popular plant to collect because they were unusual, they were challenged to grow, but very rewarding. I mean, something like a night flowering cactus, which only blooms very unpredictably for a short time. These were plants to boast about, so you wanted them to show them off in special pots. And some of them, we can see from the pictures, were just gutted up wooden tubs, but many were extraordinarily ornamental with lots of curlicue embellishments and what looks like gold work. But if you're interested, you can go and see what a historic collection from this era would have looked like. At Hampton Court Palace, the garden team has spent many years recreating the exotic collection of Queen Mary, as in William and Mary. And in the summer, the citrus trees and a great range of succulents and other tender plants that were in her collection are set up outside in their pots. They're not quite as gaudy as some of the ones depicted in Weinmann's book, but they do present a lovely display, and appropriately, given that William and Mary came over from Holland to be king and queen here, quite a few of them are in the style of blue and white Delft pottery.
Oh, I did not know that, and that is good to know because I do love a bit of pottery, so I'll have to get myself down there. So you were talking before about the artists who were commissioned. Who did paint these specimens? Was it all the work of one person, or was it a variety of artists?
No, there were quite a few people who contributed to it. And it sounds weird to us now, but we don't know who they were mostly, because it was quite usual in those days, although it seems outrageous now, but they were anonymous. They didn't sign their work, and all credit went to the engravers, who, of course, had enormous skill because they had to translate the original artwork onto copper plates for printing. And so we do know their names, and Weinmann used the best of the best, and they're prominently listed there on the title page. There were three of them, Soiter, Reidinger and Hyde. But having said the original artists went unacknowledged, we do know full details of one, and his name is Georg Ehret. And as a young man of 20 or so, Ehret was working his passage down the Danube with his brother, hoping to find gardening work. And they stopped off in Regensburg. And because he was known to have talent in drawing and painting, as well as growing plants, Georg was introduced to Weinmann. And at this stage, Weinmann was still at the beginning of putting together his great masterwork. And so, of course, he talked to Georg about it and showed him some of the illustrations he'd got together. And young Georg was very unimpressed and full of self-confidence. And he said, "Oh, it would be better if I did them, sir." So they came to an arrangement. Weinmann would provide board and lodging and a modest fee, and Ehret would produce 1,000 paintings in a year. It doesn't take much to realise that completing something like 3 paintings a day was not a realistic expectation. And when his year was up, Ehret had only done 500, which is pretty fast work anyway. But Weinmann didn't agree. He wouldn't pay Ehret the full amount, and the two men parted on less than friendly terms. I've gone into a little bit of detail here in case any of your listeners have any knowledge of botanical art, because for them, Georg Ehret will mean a great deal. He went on to paint for other less penny-pinching masters, perfecting his art, and he worked with Linnaeus for a while. And then he came over here and settled in England, and his reputation just grew and grew. He became wildly acclaimed. He painted for great collectors and plantsmen like Sir Hans Sloane, after whom Sloane Square is named, and Joseph Banks. And you can see his art still today in many prominent galleries and museums. And Chelsea Pottery also used his work to decorate some of their china. And although it's not known for sure which plants in the Iconographia can be attributed to Ehret, it's usually acknowledged that many of the aloes and the flowering cacti were his.
Yeah, interesting. Actually, I was going to ask you if you could match them, but as you say, being so anonymous, it must have been difficult. So the books were printed. Do you know what sort of print run they would have had originally?
Yes, we know precisely. Amazing after so long.
Yeah.
Because it was done by subscription. And so there is a record of that sort of thing. And there were only 600 copies of the complete book ever printed. And it was big, it was expensive, and of course it got bigger. I don't know what Weinmann had in mind at the beginning, but when they brought out the first volume, which was 250 or so pages, that was in 1737, he was doing it alphabetically, and that only brought him to the end of the B's, Buxus, box. So he had quite a way to go. And so it ended up being 4 volumes. And the last one came out in 1744. But Weinmann died 3 years before that, so he never saw his full work done.
Oh, that's a shame. I mean, when it was published, obviously it was sold by subscription, but again, do you know anything about the kind of people who would have purchased it?
Well, I think the short answer is rich people.
Yeah, I guess so. Kind of for a reference. And I guess also with a vested interest in growing those plants.
Exactly. I mean, it would have been a big investment. And many of his subscribers and purchasers would have known Weinmann by reputation, if not personally. And there was a prestige in owning something like this. So if you had the money to do so, it was definitely something to bandy about. And so there would have been wealthy collectors, but also fellow pharmacists and scientists, or natural philosophers, as they called them, because this was the age of enlightenment, and Europeans were rapidly colonizing the far reaches of the world and bringing back a great many intriguing new plants. Knowledge was expanding really, really fast, and there was a huge thirst for it. And with it came an increasing need to categorize things. And this, of course, included plants. And I think it's significant that this was exactly when Carl Linnaeus was working on his revolutionary new classification system. But it hadn't quite taken off by the time Weinmann was doing his work. That's why he decided to do it alphabetically. But there was an explosion of interest in sort of, they weren't quite scientists, but they were edging towards a more scientific, a more rational explanation for everything. And that iconographia fits into that mold.
Yeah, and kind of looking back on it down the tunnel of history, as I was saying, we kind of know there are a lot more plants today, and I think fair to say our knowledge of plants has advanced over the centuries in lots of ways. But when I was reading the books, I was thinking these are really beautiful aesthetic things, but also it made me think, are historical kind of botanical texts merely a curiosity, or can they inform our knowledge of horticulture in the present day?
Well, I suppose that they are more of historic than practical use, but there are many nuggets of information to be mined out of them. If you think about it, when we look at old paintings, we can learn about how people dressed and lived, what they believed and ate and held dear, what a countryside once looked like. And old texts and illustrations like these are a similar window into the past. And sometimes we can be surprised at what we see. I discovered, for instance, that a couple of what we think of as new vegetables are nothing of the kind. For example, in our own childhoods, all carrots were always orange, weren't they? But now we see in seed catalogues and shops and restaurants white, yellow, purple varieties. But there was a time when these were the more normal colour for carrots, and it was only in the 16th century that orange became the standard colour.
Yeah, it was. It was very striking how exotic a lot of the stuff was that they were documenting. Actually, as I read it, I thought, wow, there's kind of nothing new under the sun, is there? We get all these new varieties released and think we're all novel, but actually they've been around for ages, variations of them. So thinking about that as well, kind of surprises in the book and during your research, did you come across any really surprising medicinal uses for plants? I'm not suggesting that they're replicable today, but just out of interest, was there anything that kind of struck you as unusual?
Well, now I must be honest here. I did not read the whole text because it's in Latin and completely unreadable black letter Gothic German. So it was only when I particularly wanted to know about something that I delved in. And there's an awful lot about purging. Purging was very popular indeed. And that's why, I know this, one of the common name for a lot of euphorbias is spurge, because it was used for purging. But yeah, I did come across some interesting little things. There's what do we call it? It's Guttergummi. It's an odd plant. And people really, at that time, had no idea where it came from. It was shrouded in mystery. But they used it just the same. And artists used it for sorry, this shows you how wide-ranging it was, because artists wanted it for painting, because that's gomboge. That's what they call gomboge, which is a yellow colour. But then medicos used it for sciatica and liver disease. So it's astonishing, this wide range of applications. And cotyledons, those pretty little succulents with little sprays of flowers, they were used for getting rid of warts and verrucas, but also kidney stones and upset stomachs. And I think my favourite example of something I learned was that lettuces have had a much more varied, useful life than we might imagine. At different times, they've been considered good for perking up your sex life, but also rather the opposite, to induce a pleasant drowsiness. The Romans used to munch on them after meals. And that particular little tidbit made me remember how Beatrix Potter's bunnies all fell asleep in Mr. McGregor's garden after eating too many leaves. Mm-hmm. And Miss Potter knew her plants.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really true. It must have been brilliant to research it, I have to say, apart from perhaps translating. But the books are beautiful because of the illustrations in them. And as I was reading, I was thinking, oh, this would make such a good piece of art to hang on the wall. And then I thought, I couldn't possibly deface your lovely books. So then it made me think, we're not reliant on engravers. We can quite easily replicate images. Can you actually source any of these images and as art today?
Oh, gosh, yes. There are plenty of places offering modern prints of them at very reasonable prices. Or if you've got a bit more to spend, you can still buy the originals too, because it seems sacrilegious completely, but many copies of Weinmann's books were later broken up and the plates framed or sold on, either individually or in sets. And so you see them coming up at auctions or in galleries that specialize in original prints. But if you want to go for a whole volume, they're much rarer, obviously. You could try hunting one down. But most of the copies that survive intact are securely in the hands of research institutions like the Wellcome Foundation or Kew, and university libraries, of course. And the Bodleian, where, as I said, the images from my books come from, have got two sets, a 4-volume and an 8-volume, because some of the books were bound, the images and the texts were bound separately.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that they found good lodgings. Kind of as an aside, and this is your second appearance on the podcast, I just wondered, have you got anything else in the pipeline that you want to or can talk about?
Early days yet, but again, for the Bodleian, we're sort of discussing the possibilities of a different take or something new on pioneer women gardeners.
Thank you, Caroline, for talking about this amazing body of work. And thanks to you, as always, for listening. Dr. Ian Bedford is here now, talking about bug tongues.
I'm sure that everyone who enjoys their garden will welcome the sight of butterflies fluttering amongst their flowers. Many of us would have planted specific plants for the butterflies, plants whose flowers produce copious amounts of nectar, which is the vital source of energy for these beautiful, delicate insects. One of the most well-known is Buddleia, commonly known as the butterfly bush. And sure enough, Buddleias are an excellent source of nectar, flowering throughout the summer months and an obvious magnet to butterflies. But have you ever noticed that despite many butterflies feeding on the Buddleia, there's not actually many different species? Peacocks, small tortoiseshells, red admirals, painted ladies, commas and cabbage whites are frequent visitors. But where are the blues, the browns, the speckled woods, small coppers, ringlets and skippers? Well, there's actually a very simple answer. The corolla depth is the distance from the lip of a flower to its nectar source within, and this varies considerably between plant species. Buddleias have a corolla depth of 9 millimetres, yet many of our butterfly species only have 7 to 8 millimetre long tongues, which means they can't access the Buddleia's nectar. It's only accessible to the long-tongued species, which are the ones that you'll see feeding on the Buddleia flowers. So it's always worth planting some summer flowering plants that have short corolla depths and provide plenty of nectar for the short-tongued butterflies, perennial wallflowers, Verbena bonariensis and Helianthus, to name just a few.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.